In the last podcast episode, a reference was made to the pomander, piece of jewelry that was very popular in the past. And it made me reflect on the enjoyment I find when delving into the stories of pieces of jewelry from the past. And there are many inspirational places where these pieces can be seen and these stories can be unraveled. One of my favorite places in London for this reason is the V&A. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to speak to someone today who not only has had an immediate impact on the institution as a curator for 20 years, but has also recently joined the British Academy of Jewellery as Associate Lecturer in Critical and Historical Studies to share her knowledge of jewellery history and use those inspirational narratives to ponder the reasons why we wear jewellery and the impact of jewellery with students. To talk to me today about her fascination for the subject, her career to date, and why she thinks looking back can inspire looking forward, I would like to welcome Rachel Church. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, and thanks so much for asking me. I'm really looking forward to this.
So, Rachel, my first question to you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I started off really fascinated by history, and I think you can often, if you look back in your childhood and the kind of things you enjoyed doing then, I think you can often see the seeds of your future career. So my childhood stamp collecting, my beautifully curated sugar cube collection, my, articles cut out of airline magazines, I think all pointed the way towards a curatorial future. But having said that, I never intended to go into a national museum, and I never really thought about jewellery as a subject. I came to it very much by accident. I studied Renaissance, like early modern and medieval jewellery at university. I did an MA in museum studies, and then I thought, what better time to do something completely different? So I spent 2 years in Japan as an English teacher, or kind of associate English teacher in 2 Japanese high schools, which was really fascinating and gave me a very thick skin when my students fell asleep at the back of the class, which they inevitably did because they're very overscheduled and hardworking. I came back, looked for a museum job, and landed in the V&A, and rather to my surprise, ended up staying there for a very long time, and graduate after about, I think only about 3 or 4 years, made my way into the jewellery department, and there I stayed, working on all sorts of fantastic projects.
It is perhaps fair to say, having been a curator, have become a jewellery lover. Could you elaborate on what has kept your fascination in the subject and why you chose not to perhaps become a maker as well, but rather choose curation and research in the field?
I don't think I was ever going to become a maker because I suspect I have a fundamental lack of artistic talent or skills. Sophie's waving her finger there, but certainly when I was at school, art felt very much as if it was about drawing. And if you couldn't draw, which I couldn't really, or not with any appreciable talent, it felt like art was a completely closed door. But what I really love about jewellery is that I think it's an artwork which is all about people. And I mean, jewellery is beautiful. It's made of beautiful materials. It doesn't have to be, but it often is. But what I really liked about it was the way that it shone such a light on people's lives, and often very personal moments of their life, the birth of their children, the death of their relatives, their love affairs, but through such a variety of forms and means of expression. So it felt as if it was an art form that there was always something new and interesting to learn about.
Perhaps for those listening who may not quite know what a curator does, could you tell us a little bit more about the practice of curation and what a day in the life of a curator looks like?
Well, the root of the word curation is to care, and I think that's the fundamental element of it. Curators are people who care for the material resource of the past, the objects that people made. So partly in its most basic sense, it's collecting and looking after those objects, keeping them safe from dust and pests and keeping track of them. That's been quite a topical subject recently. Keeping these objects safe to be enjoyed by future generations. But having said that, and that's the bottom line, you have to collect your objects, look after your objects, keep track of your objects. But there's no point in collecting things that nobody can see or enjoy or learn from. So the other really important part, I think, of being a curator is making the objects accessible physically and intellectually. So physically by putting displays in galleries, interpreting objects through whatever labels, computer interactives and so on, help people to find their way into them. Museum displays can be very overwhelming sometimes. So part of the job of a curator is to help people find a route into the collection, but also making the objects accessible intellectually. So researching them, cataloguing them, photographing them, putting them online, sharing the objects with individual researchers, but also groups of students, interested parties. And the V&A, I think, was very good at that. And we hosted everybody from members of a family who were researching family history, students, makers, historical reenactors, designers, anybody really who felt that they would be helped by having access to these objects. I'd say the life of a curator is probably completely different depending on the institution you're in. In a small museum, you would be doing everything. You'd be hoovering out the dead beetles at the back of the case, putting a display on, writing your label, sending it to the printers, planning your display, taking the school group in, going off to the local factory which is closing down and collecting objects that you might want to add to the collection, and then probably finishing off with an evening at the local town hall to try and persuade your local government to continue funding you. In a big museum, it's much more specialised. But having said that, I think every curatorial job has its very glamorous aspects where you're collecting wonderful objects, and its very mundane aspects where you might be typing up lists or ticking things off in a store, or crawling around on your hands and knees trying to work out why the light in the case isn't coming on and how to get it fixed before the museum opens at 10 a.m. So I think it's a career that's got endless variety and opportunity, and that's, I think, one of the very appealing things about it.
When I'm thinking about curation as well, that idea of communicating the objects and making sense of perhaps the past and or of an era, and then using objects to share stories. What's the hardest thing about curation when you think about communication as well with an audience?
I think museums, or bodies which share objects, share arts, have got a lot more conscious of the need to bring in different voices, to not just have this overarching, anonymous, authoritative museum voice, and also to try and meet people where they're coming from. I mean, some old school museum labels could be very opaque. You get a label which said something like, this crozier is very similar to the one found in the monastery of St. Gall in wherever, and is the technique of cloisonné enamelling is reminiscent of X. And you think, well, that's great. If you start off knowing what a crozier is, what cloisonné enamel is, you've got any idea what the thing in the monastery of X looks like. It's not helping the average member of the public. And sometimes it felt as if museums were very much talking to this small body of connoisseurs in the know. And I think that's something that's completely changed in the last 30 or so years. But there are also a lot of politics now, I think, in museum interpretation. So a lot of pushback against some of the wish to explore some of the more difficult ideas behind the objects. And I think that's a work in progress, working out how to bring in these diverse voices, the critical ones as well as the supportive ones, and come to some sort of path where it's a discussion, and it's not that all discussion's been shut down because people don't like what you're saying, or you're putting your foot down and saying, this is the one true label and I will live and die by it. So I think it's a real balancing act, and it's quite a difficult one, particularly at the moment.
In your career, you've had the opportunity to handle really some of the world's most famous pieces of jewelry. Could you tell us a little bit more about a specific memorable experience you've had with a piece of jewelry in your career?
It's always pretty awe-inspiring to say, pick up a jewel and think this is the jewel which, maybe Elizabeth I gave to Sir Francis Drake. I mean, that's hands-on contact with major historical figures. But I think probably the most fun and the most excitement I've had have not been with those really top level jewels. One of my most exciting moments as a curator was opening an email one day from somebody who was a volunteer at this small local museum in Totnes, pretty much entirely volunteer run. And one of their big treasures, this ring that they had, was this very pretty little early 17th century painted enamel ring with some little arches and people underneath them, and this inscription which read T to RL and RL to T and T to CL is what their ring read. And they said that they'd done a lot, they actually knew quite a lot about this. And historically, it's incredibly common to not know anything about where your jewels come from or where the provenance comes from. And this is a little bit of a cryptic inscription. But they said that one thing they did know about it is it had been one of a pair, and they were trying to track down the other one. And, would I be able to give them any pointers? And I looked at it and I thought, I know this object. And I know it really well because the pair that you're looking for is in the jewellery gallery downstairs. And so firstly, it was really exciting to bring these two rings back together, made around about 1640, which had parted ways like at least 100 years previously. But the thing that was really fun about it is that the V&A had bought their ring from this little antique shop down on the south coast. And it didn't come with any history at all. Nobody knew who T and RL, and our ring said T to KL. And we didn't, it had a maker's mark on, but it didn't have a hallmark because jewellery wasn't hallmarked at that point. It was painted enamel, so it couldn't be too early, we felt. But we didn't really know anything about the story behind it. And Totnes, because their ring had come down through another branch of the family, knew exactly what it was made for. So it was a ring which was made to commemorate this local merchant called Richard Lee, who had funded the building of this kind of arcade for the merchants of the town to trade in. So these were the little arches and the little people on it. And to commemorate this gift, I mean, it was initially presented as a gift. Actually, further investigation showed that it really just lent them the money. And when the money was paid back by the town, Totnes, so RL to T is Richard Lee funding this arcade for Totnes. T to CL or KL is Totnes having these rings made for the two daughters of Richard Lee, Christian Lee and Catherine Lee. So when the loan is finally paid back, the town decides to commemorate this piece of jewellery to give to the two daughters. And it goes down through Catherine's branch of the family and Christian's branch of the family. Actually, I think Catherine dies without heirs, and it goes to her sister and so on. But it goes that they've managed to trace it down. So we spent quite a lot of time researching this. You can find this ring in wills. The people at Totnes Museum found the actual record in the town records where they'd paid for the making of this piece of jewellery. It was the most amazing thing. And Totnes got a grant from the Art Fund so they could fund the loan of the V&A ring to come back to Totnes to be reunited with its long lost cousin. And it was just such a fun project. And it was so nice to bring these two bits of local history together and to be able to support a really small museum to do this really big project. So that's probably one of my most fun museum jewellery moments.
That's amazing. What a story. I think that's pretty remarkable to find two pieces that then end up finding each other again somehow. Are they still together or are they back each in a different location?
They're each back in their own homes. So the V&A one is back in the jewellery gallery, and the Totnes one I think is still on display in the Totnes Museum. So if anyone finds themselves in the west of England, then go and say hello to it because it is really a lovely object.
So on your website, The Life of Jewels, you explore the hidden history of jewelry, the, as you say, touching, surprising, and sometimes downright weird objects which have touched people's lives. What objects have you explored so far through your website, and what are your plans for the website?
Well, I really set up the website as a little fun side project because I spend a lot of my research time ends up going through newspapers and magazines and so on. And you just find the weirdest and wackiest things when you start looking. And well, it's not really academic journal fodder, and I didn't really want to take it that far. But I thought it would be a shame for the rest of the world not to enjoy these moments of pure strangeness. I have to say I have got a little bit of a penchant for the weird. So that was kind of it. And also the other more serious thing is I thought it might be a good place to put resources for people who are interested in jewellery. So reading lists and places to go to find online talks and, places to go and see jewellery, because it can be a little bit hard to make your way through the maze of the internet. One of my favourite weird stories, and I don't even know if it's true, this is based on a newspaper account, was this Irish MP who died at a fairly, respectable age, having had this very unremarkable career, nothing particularly odd about it. But according to this newspaper article, when he died, he was wearing a locket around his neck, which is, not unusual. A lot of 19th century men wear lockets, and that's really how I came onto him, because it was something I was researching. But inside this locket, it said were the cremated ashes of his wife's heart. And I thought, well, that's a little bit odd. I mean, the idea of hearts being treated differently in burials is not unknown, but it's not that common, particularly not in the mid-19th century. So my first question was, well, how on earth did he get hold of his wife's heart as a separate thing and have it cremated? Because if the whole body was cremated, it would all be mixed up together. So that was a bit of a startling moment. And then I continued reading, and it said that when his house in Ireland was being cleared, they found this room which nobody but he had access to, in which was found the very well preserved body of his wife, minus the heart. And it may not be true. This may be the Freddie Starr ate my hamster story of the 19th century. But it did raise such a lot of questions, particularly as when his wife died, and she was quite a bit younger than him, and she didn't survive the marriage for very long because, as was depressingly common, she became pregnant a year or so after they married and died in childbirth, or as through childbirth related injury, but no surviving child either. So it's a very sad story. And he had a very large, expensive sarcophagus style coffin built for her, in which everybody, I'm sure, believed that she was lying resting. So I just think, yeah. I mean, the sentimental locket with a bit of hair would have been completely normal, a little, a picture, a bit of a favourite dress. The cremated heart, quite weird. The body, Bluebeard style in the locked room, I think took it up a whole other notch.
That's quite a crazy story. Evidenced by the books written by you, you are keen to share what you have researched, as you say, from the website as well. Could you tell us about the actual books that you ended up writing and how you came about choosing the topics, rings and brooches and badges? And are you working on anything new?
Well, rings came about after we'd finished the redisplay of the Jewellery Gallery, because one of the projects I worked on for about 5 years was the completely stripping out the Jewellery Gallery, which really hadn't been reimagined since about 1980. And as part of that process, we took everything out and we re-examined all the objects in the collection, both the ones which were in store and the ones which were going back on display. And my particular one of my responsibilities were the displays of rings. The V&A has a really large collection of historic rings through the generosity of various collectors and donors. So I spent a lot of time looking at rings, and for some reason, rings tend to be one of those objects that gets written about sort of in its own right. I think there's a lot more books on the history of rings than there are on earrings, for instance, or, you know, lots of, I think it's been an area which has attracted collectors. And also I think rings are objects which are tied in with lots of different functions, you know, signet rings, mourning rings, decorative rings, marriage rings, and so on. There's lots of different ways to approach it. So after the gallery was finished, the publication department were quite keen to capitalise on the interest in jewellery and all the research we've been doing. And they suggested like a book on rings might be nice, as well as a reissue of the lovely Jewels and Jewellery book by Claire Phillips, which is a beautiful handbook, a kind of, you know, really great introduction to the collection. So I thought, yeah, why not? That sounds fun. I've already done lots of work on it. I have to say, I'd never written anything as long as that before, and I didn't have very much time to do it. They, you know, publication departments have their own timescales, and what I didn't realise before I went into it is that the time you spend writing and researching it is about half the time they've allocated the publication, and the time you're going to spend editing it, checking your footnotes, sorting out images and all that kind of thing, it is just as long. So I had about, I think, maybe 9 months from, hey, why don't you do a book on rings, to, by the way, your copy was due last week, where is it? It was quite a speedy process, and I think it was good. I'd love to go back and kind of pick up all these things, because there are lots of things that I thought, you know, there's so much more you could find out about this object. But it is a nice introduction to the objects in the gallery and to, like, rings, yeah, again, very much from a social history side more than a design side. But because the V&A has got such a wonderful collection, there are lots of lovely objects to choose from. So that was rings. The V&A used to do its publications in-house, but round about 10 years ago, maybe a bit less, they decided to pair up with Thames and Hudson. And as part of that process, Thames and Hudson were going through the back catalogue and seeing what they wanted, you know, to reprint under their own imprint. So I did an updated version of rings for them, which wasn't, it was a fairly light update, but it was a chance to put a few extra objects in and to collect that one thing that I knew was wrong that had, you know, skipped through in the first round. And I was chatting to the person from the publications department, you know, one of those idle Friday afternoon conversations where I said, oh, have you, you know, do you think you'd like to do any more books on jewellery? And, you know, jewellery books sell well, so they're quite keen on them. And she said, oh, yeah, you know, we'd be up for ideas. Is there anything you're thinking about? And kind of off the top of my head, I said, well, nobody's really done very much on brooches. You know, how about that? And they were very enthusiastic. And they said, oh, yeah, put a proposal together. You know, we'd be really keen to do this. So I did, and it got signed off by the publications department. And then I had this awful problem, because I thought, it's actually a much harder subject than rings, because, you know, there's not much debate about what a ring is. It's a jewel that goes on your finger, and it can be large, small, made of pretty much anything you want, but that's the fundamental outline of it. Brooches and badges, I wanted to look at it chronologically, because I thought that's a nice, easy way to organise it and kind of interesting for people to read. And then I thought, well, people aren't always wearing brooches and badges. You know, what happens in, say, the kind of late Renaissance, where brooches are not really that worn? What am I going to do? Can I count, like, does it have to have a pin, for instance? Can it be sewn onto the clothing? Because then I could do hat badges and breast ornaments and stomachers and objects like that. So I did have a little bit of a struggle with my terms of reference, and also it was very much based, I mean, entirely based on the V&A collections. So if we didn't have a type of jewellery, then I couldn't spend too much time talking about it, and I wouldn't be able to illustrate it. So after I got through this hump, which I solved in a very self-serving way by basically deciding that if I thought it was a brooch, it was a brooch, and it was going to go in, and I could have hat badges and pilgrim badges and stomachers and so on. And then after that, it was just really fun, because it was an excuse to go and read like back issues of the New Yorker and Vogue and the Illustrated London Times, and like 19th century, not 18th century crime reports and all sorts of things. And yeah, I had a lot of fun with it. And I think, and the team who made it a really beautiful book, I think.
And are you working on anything new, or are you not looking to write a book immediately?
Well, I mean, I've got a couple of ideas of books I'd love to write. I mean, the problem with publishing is that really nobody's going to publish a book that they don't think they can sell. So you have to pick the right topic and find a publisher who wants to, thinks that they can find a market for it. I am writing an article at the moment on, it's a bit niche, I have to say, but I got very interested in masculine jewellery because I think it opens up such a lot of interesting questions about identity and representation and, ideas about gender and so on. And also I think it's a form of jewellery that's been really forgotten. If you read like a big book on jewellery, it'll often be jewellery, and then there'll be a little section at the end of the chapter on men's jewellery. And I think there's a lot more to say about it than that. And I also went down a bit of a rabbit hole with lockets because of some work I was doing looking at debt cases related to young men who were spending too much money on jewellery and trying to get out of paying their jewellers. And some of the things that they were buying and not wanting to pay for were lockets. And I was thinking, I hadn't really thought about lockets much to start with, but I hadn't really thought about them as being male jewels. I think I thought of them as being very kind of stereotypically feminine. It turns out I was completely wrong on that. But I'd started digging into male lockets and just found such a lot of material, not just, surviving objects are hard to attribute, but lots and lots of evidence in letters, in stories. Like fiction's a wonderful source of information because it tells you not just what people were wearing, but it often gives you some hint about why it was important to them or what the social use was. But also lots of information in things like breach of promise cases and divorce cases. Quite a surprising number of women divorcing their husbands because they had a locket with a picture of the wrong woman in, for instance. So and presentation lockets, like lockets being given to like men going away to war with pictures of their families or retirement gifts. Anyway, I could go on about this for a lot longer than would be interesting for anyone but me, I fear. But yes, at the moment I'm trying to pull that together into an article.
Talking about and hearing you talk about the books you've written, and I'm thinking it's often challenging to have definitions, even not just what is a ring, what is a brooch, and it ends up being someone makes a definition and then we live by that, those kind of criteria. But even for just jewelry, do you feel the V&A has and you yourself have had made a clear definition of what a piece of jewelry is and what it isn't?
Well, it's an interesting question, isn't it? I was talking about this with the BAJ students last week about wearability. Does a piece of jewelry have to be wearable? Can you make a piece of jewelry which is fundamentally unwearable? And to my mind, that pushes it over the edge into sculpture. I think even if it's not comfortable or practical or, I think it has to have the basic possibility of being worn. Maybe you can't move your arm, maybe your head is held at a strange angle, perhaps it's so heavy you couldn't stand up, but I think it has to at least be able to interact with the body in some way. But I don't know whether that's a universally held definition at all. The jewellery historically has been able to be made out of pretty much any material you can think of. It's used techniques from the most basic, drill a hole through a seed or a shell and string it around your neck, to the most wonderful feats of craft and skill. So I think, the V&A's remit for jewellery collecting was very much to do with sort of craft and innovation. So it was particularly for more contemporary pieces. The aim was to collect pieces which advanced the discussion of jewellery in some way, that were doing something interesting technically or artistically or making a statement that was interesting. But you could build a completely different collection on different remits, and other museums do. If you go to the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, who also collect jewellery, they're probably using a different collecting principle, and you might want to have a museum which was collecting the kind of very best of the like big jewellery brands, for instance, and that would be another way to do it. You could have a collection of, you know, very jewellery from a social history point of view, so not expensive in terms of material culture, but interesting from a fashion point of view or from a social use point of view.
Yeah, I would say it's probably a good idea to question that when you walk into a museum or a gallery even as well. Who has been the people collecting it? What has been the ethos behind this collection? And where do they define what is jewelry and what is not? And so it's often quite interesting to ask this question of yourself when you walk into this curated display of objects, which is, it's always really interesting to see that subject through the eyes of the team that is behind the collection as well.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting to think, you know, what am I seeing and what am I not seeing? Who isn't being represented here? But I think it's also important to understand quite how much museum collections are a little bit accidental. Some objects have been very deliberately collected, and sometimes you have a huge collection of one thing because you had a donor or a collector who was passionate about that and gave it all to the museum. And suddenly, I mean, the V&A has an enormous collection of silver bottle tickets, for example, which are these little labels that you put around the neck of a decanter back when, you know, your wine or brandy came in a cask. And there's probably about 1,000 of them. And they're all different. They're all very different individually. But that's not because the V&A thought what we really need to do is to represent, you know, bottle tickets in their entirety. It's because somebody who was passionate about them came along and said, I have my 1,000 bottle tickets and I really, really want to keep this collection together and to make it available to the public. And I think you're the right place for it. You know, one of the books on the history of the V&A was called Vision and Accident. And I think that sums up most museum collections. You know, you need the vision, but you have to open yourself up to the accident.
You have recently joined BAJ as Critical and Historical Studies Associate Lecturer, teaching jewellery history to bachelor students, but also looking forward. How important do you think it is for students to familiarise themselves with the past and perhaps traditions of our profession?
Well, I talked to the students about this in the very first session I did with them, and my sales pitch was partly that it's really interesting and they're going to spend the next 3 years thinking about jewellery, making jewellery. So I thought, you know, they've got to be a captive audience for people who want to hear about jewellery history, surely. But I thought that it could be a really interesting source of inspiration for them, because nobody's creating objects in a vacuum. And I think it's useful for you to know what people before you have made as a bit of a jumping off point, as a source of inspiration. You know, maybe it teaches you what you don't like and you look at it and you think nobody has, you know, done this thing that I think would be really interesting and important. Or maybe you take like a historical form, like, you know, like a signet ring, for instance, and think about how you can reinvent it and remake it. And I do think knowing what's there is a good starting off point for reinvention. The other thing I think is that making jewellery is a very communicative art. You know, you're making something that's telling a story, whether it's the story of your engagement or your graduation or the special piece of jewellery you bought when you got, you know, your first job or a promotion. Or there's lots of interesting kind of emotional reasons why people want to buy and wear jewellery. And I think if you can tap into some of the history of that, and you're, say, selling a new engagement ring, and you can tell your customers about the history of engagement rings or how people have worn them in the past, then I think it gives you something interesting to talk about. So I do think it's interesting and important, and I think it's something that a lot of makers aren't taught about on their courses, and they maybe have to go away and discover themselves as part of their practice.
Can be incredibly inspirational, and it's really good to also see that ideas and sometimes trends, they change through time, and that can be interesting to question why we wear jewelry. What does it say about us as people? How do we engage with the topic and wear it, and where do we wear it, and how do then makers respond to those needs? So all of those questions can be asked when we look at things from the past as well. In your role, you are also looking forward with the students who are really going to be the next generation in the industry. What do you think the future of jewelry will look like? What do you hope students will want to change, explore, perhaps make, do, question?
I think that it's been really interesting and inspiring to work with the students, because everybody's bringing their own ideas and their own sort of background. Everyone's coming from a particular point, and is wants to share it with their fellow students. I hope what the students will come out with is their own voice, that they'll, some of them may go into industry, some of them may become individual makers, some of them may not end up going into jewelry and do something quite different. But I think I'm really excited to see what routes they're going to take. In terms of things that to question in the field, there's a lot of much needed discussion around sustainability, particularly. So I think the students need to really think about what materials they're using and where those materials are coming from. And there's lots of debate around single mine origin gold or silver, the fair trade gold standard. The V&A actually was the first public institution to acquire a piece of fair trade gold, this amazing ring by Uta Decker, where lab-grown gemstones fit into the story. The pros and cons of recycled metal. I mean, metal recycling is nothing new for the jeweler, but I think you have to be very clear about, what exactly that means, and what kind of traceability you can have. So I think there's a lot of questions to think about there. I feel a little bit that some jewelers are going very much down the kind of CAD design, 3D printing, using a lot of technology, and that's definitely one route, and you can make really interesting work that way. I think other jewelers are really making a virtue of the handmade, the sort of very personal element, and that's another route to go down. And I think they're both interesting and valid routes, and I think the students are going to have time to explore on the course which route feels right for them and which is the best way for them to get their ideas and their artistic vision across. Yeah, and I hope that they'll be thinking about how they fit into the wider jewelry landscape, whether it's down the sort of artist jewelry craft route, or whether it's as a small, artist maker. Do they want to work for a company? Do they want to just be a designer? Do they want to set up their own studio? Yeah, there's lots of different routes for them to explore.
When looking at a pomander, you see the technical excellence with which the structure has been made, seamlessly allowing the various compartments containing scents to open for refilling and close for safekeeping. The story of an expert maker can be traced by admiring the surface finish and intricate details that have been added to the functional ornament. Then there is the question who commissioned the piece and who has used and held and cherished the object in its lifetime. As a prelude to perfume, which has become a large market in itself, the pomander sheds some light on our relationship with scents and what our surroundings must have smelled like in the past, and how jewelry from the past can inspire artists, designers, and makers in the present. Someone who has dedicated time and attention to unraveling and sharing stories of jewelry objects, so we all have access to them for inspiration, is Rachel. for your efforts and contribution to date, and for your time today. I would really like to thank you very much. We look forward to seeing what you will be working on in the future, both personally and with the BAJ students. Thanks, Rachel.
Oh, thank you. It's been really fun.
Next month, I'll be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. But for now, this was Sophie Boons for the BAJ podcast series with the episode Tracing Jewelry Stories with Rachel Church. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.